Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's an expectation of absolute precision. It feels almost like engineering.
Yeah, exactly. It's visible. You break an arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there's the problem. It's deeply comforting to have that binary answer.
Right. We want to categorize our pain, but then you step into the world of health psychology, and suddenly that x-ray machine it's completely useless. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a really fascinating topic today.
It really is.
Yeah.
Today, our mission is to act as your one-on-one tutoring session, walking you through Chapter 2 of Health Psychology, Biopsychosocial Interactions. We're exploring a massive paradigm shift in how we understand the human body, the biopsychosocial model.
Which is basically this radical idea that your physical biology, your psychological state, and your social environment, they aren't separate. They're constantly and sometimes violently interacting to shape your health.
And the most striking way to understand this isn't through some abstract theory. It's through a human life. The chapter prologue introduces us to a young man named Tom.
Right. Born 20 years ago. And his parents initially just thought he was a colicky, incredibly hungry baby. I mean, he drank massive amounts of milk, but never gained weight.
Yeah. And then came the wheezing, the endless respiratory infections, until they finally got the fatal diagnosis, which was cystic fibrosis. It causes the body to produce this abnormally thick, sticky mucus in the respiratory system.
And reading about Tom's early life is just heartbreaking. People would ask him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and his answer was, I'm going to be an angel.
Oh, wow.
By age 20, he had reached that statistical milestone where half of the people diagnosed with this disease pass away. What's fascinating here is how Tom's story perfectly illustrates this biopsychosocial model we're talking about.
Because it starts with biology, right?
Yeah.
The genetic inheritance.
Exactly. But that biology doesn't exist in a vacuum. Because he was constantly sick and physically weak, his social relationships were severely stunted. And that intense social isolation placed a massive psychological burden on him and his parents.
It's a closed circuit. The physical illness creates social isolation, which creates psychological trauma, which loops back to weaken the body even further. And to really master this, we're going to map out the body's physical systems: nervous, endocrine, digestive, respiratory, cardiovascular, and immune, in the exact order they appear in the text.
And if we're tracing that chain reaction from a thought in your brain all the way down to a white blood cell, we have to start with the nervous system. It's the body's high-speed electrical grid.
Right, the control center. Every thought, every panic attack, it's all driven by neurons. And looking at the diagram in the text, figure 2.1, these neurons are fascinating. You've got the cell body and these branch-like dendrites acting as receivers.
And then the axon, which is that long tail that shoots the signal down to the next cell across a tiny gap called a synapse.
But the part I love is the myelin sheath. It's this white, fatty substance wrapping the axon. I mean, I look at it exactly like the rubber insulation on the electrical wires behind your drywall. Without it, the bare copper wires would just spark and cross signals.
That is precisely how it functions. It keeps the signal moving rapidly, and we see the devastating reality of what happens when that insulation fails in diseases like multiple sclerosis.
Oh, right, because the body degenerates the myelin in MS, right?
Exactly. The electrical signals essentially leak out. The result is uncoordinated muscles, not because the muscle is broken, but because the wire delivering the command is frayed. Interestingly, a newborn baby already has almost all the neurons they will ever possess, but their brain is only a quarter of its adult weight.
Wait, really? So what's actually growing if it isn't new neurons?
Mostly glial cells, which support the neurons and the rapid development of that myelin insulation. And if you look at figure 2.2, that myelination develops structurally from head to toe, which perfectly mirrors how a baby first gains motor control of their head, then arms, then legs.
That makes perfect sense. And that wiring dictates who we are. If we walk through the brain's geography, the forebrain has the cerebrum split into left and right hemispheres. And the lobes, frontal, temporal, occipital, parietal.
Mm-hmm.
But the frontal lobe is where health psychology really zeroes in.
Yes, because it controls skeletal muscles, but it's also the seat of our self-awareness, our planning, and our raw emotions.
And we know this definitively because of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker with the iron rod.
An incredible case. An explosion drove a massive iron rod straight up through his cheek and out the top of his skull, destroying a large chunk of his frontal lobe. Miraculously, he survived the biological trauma.
Right, he could walk and talk.
He could. But his doctor noted a profound psychological shift. Before, he was a smart, balanced businessman. Afterward, he became fitful, profane, unpredictable. His friends literally said he was no longer Gage.
It proves our psychological self is anchored in vulnerable physical tissue.
Mm-hmm.
But the brain also runs the automated machinery through the cerebellum and the brainstem, the midbrain, pons, reticular system, and medulla. I was reading how the polio virus used to attack the medulla, which is the breathing center.
Yes, which forces patients into iron lungs. And that brings us to the peripheral nervous system, specifically the autonomic division. It manages the heart, the lungs, and the digestive tract. Pure autopilot.
Okay, let's unpack this. If it's on autopilot, how does the autonomic system know whether to hype us up for a fight or calm us down for sleep?
It operates a dual branch system. You have the sympathetic branch, which is the emergency alarm. It mobilizes energy. Say you step off a curb and a car is speeding right at you.
I instantly panic.
Right, and your sympathetic system dilates your airways, spikes your heart rate, and actually pulls blood away from your digestive tract, rerouting it to your leg muscles so you can jump back.
And the parasympathetic system is the opposite.
Exactly. It conserves energy. It's the rest and digest mode. It slows the heart and gets the stomach working again. But here's the thing. We aren't entirely locked out of this autopilot. There's a clinical method called biofeedback.
Oh, where patients are hooked up to sensors.
Yes. They watch their minute biological metrics, like muscle tension, on a screen. Using operant conditioning, paralyzed patients can consciously train themselves to regain muscle control. The mind can hack the autopilot.
That is wild. But when the mind hacks the autopilot, it doesn't just use electricity, right? It uses chemicals, which transitions us to module 2, the endocrine system. If the nervous system is the high-speed wiring, the endocrine system is the slower, long-lasting chemical mailing system.
Hormones, exactly. Because electrical sparks only last a fraction of a second. For sustained action, you need the endocrine glands to dump hormones straight into the bloodstream.
So during that speeding car emergency, what's happening chemically?
It's a brilliantly synchronized handoff. The hypothalamus in the brain signals the pituitary gland, the master gland, which then releases a hormone signaling the adrenal glands to release cortisol and epinephrine.
The HPA axis.
Yeah.
Hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. But wait, let me push back a bit. Cortisol gets a terrible reputation today, but biologically it reduces swelling, right? If I sprain my ankle jumping away from that car, cortisol is a lifesaver.
In the short term, absolutely. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, chronic stress keeps those levels high. Your body doesn't know the difference between dodging a car and a looming mortgage payment.
So you're just marinating in cortisol.
Yes. And that persistent chemical bath leads to high blood pressure or peptic ulcers. And this affects all the glands, the thymus, the thyroid, which can cause hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease, and the pancreas, which manages insulin and glucagon for diabetes.
And we don't all react the exact same way. The text has this section on physiological individuality, figure 2-9. It points out how our internal plumbing, like variations in the aortic arch, and our stress reactions differ by gender, age, and weight. It completely changes how we metabolize things.
Which is a perfect segue to Module 3, the digestive system, fueling the body. Because during a sympathetic panic, digestion is treated as a non-essential luxury.
That's a massive journey. Figure 210 maps this 20-foot tube. It starts in the mouth with salivary enzymes, moves down the esophagus via peristalsis, and drops into the stomach with its hydrochloric acid and pepsin.
And a lot of people misunderstand the stomach.
So I always thought the stomach absorbs all our food into the blood, but the book says otherwise.
It's a common misconception. The stomach is a fantastic blender, but a terrible sponge. It only absorbs things like alcohol and aspirin. Most absorption happens in the small intestine, specifically the duodenum.
Right. Looking at figure 211, the inner walls have these tiny capillary-sold folds and specialized tubes called lacteals for fats.
Exactly. And assuming disorders like hepatitis or cirrhosis don't interrupt this, how we burn that fuel is our metabolism.
Which brings us to the Assess Yourself BMR chart in the text, figure 212, your basal metabolic rate. For you listening, this dictates how many calories you burn just lying around doing nothing. And it's dictated by age, gender, body surface area, and stress.
But to metabolize that food into energy, our cells absolutely require oxygen, which leads seamlessly to Module 4, the respiratory system.
The oxygen exchange. Air travels down to the alveoli, shown in figure 213, these tiny bubble-like sacs enmeshed in capillaries. And the medulla is conducting all of this, monitoring CO2 levels to adjust your breathing rate.
But we're constantly inhaling dust and bacteria, so we have protective mechanisms, like the mucociliary escalator.
Best name for a biological process ever.
It really is. Cilia, these tiny hairs, constantly push sticky trap-filled mucus up your throat so you can swallow and destroy it in the stomach.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring it right back to Tom from the prologue. His cystic fibrosis thickened this mucus, destroying the escalator. The bacteria got trapped. We see similar respiratory struggles in pneumonia, emphysema, asthma, and of course, smoking risks.
And when the lungs can't provide oxygen, the strain cascades to Module 5, the cardiovascular system, the transport highway.
Figure 214 visualizes this four-chambered heart pump. It's a closed loop. Arteries carry blood away. Veins carry it toward the heart. The right side pumps blue, CO2-laden blood to the lungs. The left side pumps red, oxygenated blood to the body, with the liver and kidneys acting as filters.
And the physics of blood pressure are crucial here. Think of a garden hose. The pressure systolic when pumping, diastolic when resting, is determined by cardiac output, blood volume, peripheral resistance, elasticity, and viscosity.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Psychological states like anger or anxiety trigger the sympathetic nervous system that physically alters these fluid dynamics, tightening the vessels and driving up blood pressure.
And the blood composition makes it more complex. Blood is plasma and formed elements, red cells for oxygen, white cells for defense, platelets for clotting. Issues here mean anemia, leukemia, or hemophilia.
And the lipids, like cholesterol, they lead to atherosclerosis, which are plaques, and arteriosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries, paving the way for heart attacks and strokes.
Which means the bloodstream isn't just a nutrient highway, it's a battlefield. Bringing us to our final module, the immune system.
The defense force, fighting against antigens, the not self-invaders like viruses or mismatched transplants.
Figure 215 unpacks this beautifully. First, the non-specific defense, phagocytes. They're scavengers that eat anything suspicious. Then the specific defenses. Cell-mediated immunity relies on T cells, matured in the thymus.
You've got the killer T cells, the memory T cells that remember invaders, the helper T cells acting as generals, and the suppressor T cells that calm things down afterward.
Exactly. And then antibody-mediated immunity relies on B cells, which produce antibodies that tag and burst invaders.
We see the biological intersections when this fails, like Bubble Boy, who had severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID, or HIV, which specifically targets helper T cells, or autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, where the body attacks itself.
But the psychological and social intersections are incredible. The Kuykolt-Glaser research. This raises an important question. How does our social life affect our white blood cells?
I mean, it sounds crazy that feeling lonely could change your cells.
But the study showed that first-year medical students facing exams and divorced women obsessing over their ex-spouses physically produced weaker immune responses. Stress directly suppresses immunity.
It's just this perfect, terrifying loop. Psychological stress from the brain's nervous system triggers the endocrine system hormones, which raise blood pressure in the cardiovascular system and suppress T cells in the immune system. Everything is connected.
It really leaves us with a provocative thought. Since every system communicates with the others, what if we stopped viewing illness as a failure of a single organ? What if we started treating it as a shift in the entire biopsychosocial balance? Could treating a patient's loneliness actually be just as vital as treating their physical symptoms?
That completely changes how you look at healthcare. You really have to treat the whole person, not just the symptom. Well, on behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for joining us for this session. Keep studying, keep questioning, and we'll catch you next time.